see Havana. You want to see the city, go Havana. It's a good idea to go now. And the other is to buy one of the many books that have been published here in the United States about Havana. I can recommend you some of them. But my idea is to give you an analysis of the city. And that analysis starts with these, that those who have to do planning know that planning is a risky profession because you say, this is what's going to happen if something different happens. Ask about the people who need to predict the weather, how frustrated they are. They said it's not going to rain and later you have a big shower. So I want to start with this. No, we don't know. Is that true? You have a design, you say this is going to do this, and something. So beware when you design something. They're considering everything. So, let's start with a portrait of the city. Havana is the most important city in the Caribbean Basin in Central America. It has a very solid and very rich historical background. But my story starts in 1959 with the revolution. Remember, January 1st, 1959, the revolution arrives, and let's see the impact of the revolution in the city. Which were the early ideas of the revolution? Then, the idea was to create a new social order, just as an activity, but in a city on the other principles. So the first contradiction appears here, is how to put a new social context in an existing city. Among those ideas, we have the idea to eliminate housing as a business, and to forbid eviction, gentrification, and homelessness. Okay? The revolution started changing things in the city. And see, the first is that urban reform that eliminated housing as a business, so that was the end of the real estate market in the city. The second is that there was a change of views in many places. Entire neighborhoods of the upper classes were completely empty, and these flat houses were reoccupied mainly by students. So these houses, the former mentioned, became dormitories for students. In 1962, a rationing system was introduced because there was a severe crisis, and this makes a difference between you and us, because in the United States, for example, you have food stamps. So you get the stamps and you buy the food wherever you want to go. In Cuba it was different. You were inscribed in a given place, and there you got your food. And this demanded to create in the city a network of places and offices to distribute and to control all this. Then, a very important event, 1964, all the small businesses were nationalized. So this is the end of the small enterprise. And in 1968, the end of the self-employment. So you must understand that after these, many places were vacant. Let's see what happened with the places later. This is what added. Daycare centers, local school, family doctors, local polyclinics, the ration card offices that control the distribution, and mass and political organizations. So these were the new institutions that occupied some of the places that later previously were vacant. What was lost here? You see restaurants, cafeterias, shops, small business, movie theaters, banks, grocery stores, produce stands. So the infrastructure of the city, the commercial structure of the city was completely altered. For example, the loss of movie houses is dramatic because we had 150 movie houses in Havana in 1959. Today, only 40. What about planning and urban control? In 1963, for the first time, an institution dedicated to planning was created. Until then, the government commissioned groups of architects or planners to give a plan for the development of the city. So this is the first institution ever created specifically for the planning in the city. But see that we are talking about an institute of physical planning. Physical planning means land planning. So it has evident limits. In 1984, the National Housing Institute was an institution that was supposed to deal with the housing issue. In 1987, a very important place, well, the first comes the merge of the Planning Institute with the Architectural Department, something that was detrimental for the architecture in the city, because the function of the architect of the city disappeared. It was just a component of the Physical Planning Institute. 1987, a very important step forward, it was the creation of the Group for the Comprehensive Development of the City. This group was a think tank designed to advise the city government on planning and all urban issues. It was an interdisciplinary team, and I worked there for more than 20 years, especially on community development. And in 1994, another interesting question. Why don't we have a community architect that will advise people on how to repair and how to modify the houses, or if they want to do something in the house, how can they do it in a qualified way? Okay, but since 1991, in Cuba started what we call the special period. The special period is an euphemistic name given to a crisis. The crisis that came after the collapse of the Soviet bloc. And see that the pressure of many problems, or dealing with many problems, promoted this improvisation versus planning. So there was an institutional deflation in all the institutions, especially at the IPF or the IMB. Community architect became a bureaucrat. Was turning to bureaucrats, saying, filling forms and putting stamps and nothing about design. Or merely not design. Even some of the architects, some of the community architects were engineers, not architects. And there was now, the changes that took place after the crisis, there was an incidence of new players in housing and services, something whose impact will come later. And then there was a predominance of the reactive versus the proactive. So always the city authorities and the planning institutions were reacting to the problems. Once the problem was there, let's see what we can do, never anticipating what could be done in the long run. And there's a predominance of what they call sectoriality. I don't know if there is a such word in English, but it's the mentality to work by sectors. This is transportation, okay. The transportation bears all the responsibilities about transportation. And health is this, and every sector works on its own place, but not interconnected. And in the end, all these, in the middle of a crisis like that, brought the lack of discipline in the institutions and in the people. So a growing indifference to the problems appeared in the citizens, and people said, well, the question here is to resolve. And later we will see. To understand the deflation, observe this. We have the levels of planning, the national, the city, the municipalities, and compare it with all of them. How many workers they have nationally? 575, but see that the Planning Institute has only 139 professionals in the whole island. They have only 74 in the city, and only 54 at the municipal level. Havana has 15 municipalities. An average municipality is 150,000 inhabitants. So that means that you have 3.6 professionals per municipality. It's evident that 3 people in a municipality as big as that can do nothing. I tell people, play chess. Don't worry about the problem. You can. Simply you can. And when you look at all Havana, the population of all Havana is only 60,000 people, and see that they have the half of the professionals that the whole city has. So there's a big disproportion between the city and the old city. And here is the scale of Havana. When you look at the model of the city, the first thing you note is different colors, because it's color-coded. But yellow color is the prevalent color. And everything you see in yellow in the model means that it was built between 1900 and 1958. That means that 80% of Havana was built in less than 60 years. Havana was built very fast and very well. But the city was growing so fast that it was growing by addition, adding space, growing. And when the revolution came, the city was frozen in the time because the early ideas was, okay, let's put more emphasis in the rest of the country instead of Havana, because there's a big difference between Havana and the rest of the country, so let's put more efforts in the rest and not in Havana. And this turned Havana into a city frozen in the time. People who visit Havana, they say, I have the sensation that I am in a movie background. I have the sensation that this is a time warp. But what happens when you visit a city that was built a long time ago in a very short period? That the city is aging at the same time. And the consequence of that on housing is that today, the average age of the housing stock in Havana is 75 years. And at least 3 houses collapse every day. More than 1,000 a year. And here comes another problem. Remember that at the beginning we said no eviction, no gentrification, and no homelessness. Homelessness is dealing with homelessness is a big problem in the city because, see this, you have 15,000 people living in temporary housing, but the demand for accommodation is 140,000. And it's mandatory for the city authorities to accommodate the people who lost their houses. And once they don't have any more vacant places to put people, they started building what they call, euphemistically, say, the transit communities. So this is one of the transit communities. And the question about the transit communities is this, that you are occupying urban land, but this is not urbanization. So the land is not urbanized. But see the vicious cycle that this originates. When we look at this, we say, okay, more dwells collapse every day? Then you need more temporary housing is demanded. For more temporary housing, you need more resources for these, and less resources for the maintenance and the repair of the housing stock. And this way, you are paying less attention to the built stock. If you pay less attention, more houses will collapse, and you are in a vicious cycle. And to understand better what do we mean by 140,000 people in demand, this equals the population of an average capital city, provincial city in Cuba. It's like building a city. So it's an overwhelming task because, I repeat, it's mandatory for the city authorities to do this. And even worse, the present transit communities, in a case that people would be able to be sent to another house, cannot be recovered because it's an irrecoverable investment. It's a very complicated question. See, the justice, social justice, is sometimes very complicated. Okay, let's see how housing evolved after the revolution. In 1959, rents were reduced by 50%. That allowed low-income people to have access to the existing housing stock, but at the same time, the reserve that always existed in the market disappeared. And the private sector that until then was the sole investor in housing was completely discouraged, and they moved back and they said, we're not going to build anymore, it doesn't make any sense. And this is the beginning of the scarcity of housing. In 1960, something that we commented before is the urban reform. Remember, since then, the housing business ended. And in 1970, there was a very interesting and popular movement of self-help construction, the Market Brigades, a movement that allowed people who apply for these to get financial and technical support from the state to build their own house. So this approach allowed thousands and thousands of people to become the owners of a house built by themselves. Okay, what about ownership? If you get a house from the state in Havana, see what happens. You're not going to pay a market price, you're going to pay a value. And the value will be determined by the age, size, condition, and location of the house. And once the value is determined, you will have 20 years to pay to the bank, a state bank. That's why there are no interest and no mortgage. There's no mortgage in Cuba. Okay? Yes.
So if you had your own house built by one of the micro brigades, did you ever get like title to it in an official capacity?
Yeah. I mean, we don't start. It's a normal ownership. As a result of all these measures, 94% of the housing stock in Cuba is private, as well as Havana. But if you live in an apartment building, and apartment buildings means 56% of the housing stock in the city, you can own the apartment but not the building. And see what happens. See the consequences of this. Because when we talk about responsibility, the law says the owners are responsible for the care and the maintenance of their property. That makes sense. But in an apartment building, the owners of the apartments do not feel responsible for the maintenance of the building. They say, the apartment is mine, I don't know the rest, I don't care. And if people don't care, building management is not effective, tenant boards are just formal, and here is a cost of the city disrepair. People go to the city and say, well, there's a big disrepair here. You have a reason here, especially in the apartment buildings. And the other question, can you maintain what you own? Let's analyze the following chart. You see, you have a laser pointer here? Yes. Let's analyze the following chart. The average monthly salary in Cuba today is 450 Cuban pesos, CUP. That equals 18 convertible pesos. Remember, we have two currencies in Cuba. Or 20 American dollars. This is the average monthly salary now. Okay? Suppose there's a person earning this salary and that person would like to paint the house. A gallon of paint will mean 30% of the salary. That's it. Simple. Painting is nothing, because if you need a toilet, you will need 444%. But a window will represent 833%. So now you understand that this is the second cause of this repair. That many, many people don't have the means to maintain what they own. And see the contradiction between owning and maintaining. You get the house by the value. But every time you go, you need something to maintain your house, you need to pay a market price. Okay? But now we will move to the other end of the question to discover a surprise. Who builds more? People. People are building 2-3 times more than the state. It's interesting because, see, the crisis, the collapse of the Soviet Union is here. See? They never rested. While the state was practically idling here, the people were building, they were in charge for the housing construction. And you may wonder, how is that possible? What made that happen? To understand this, we need to go back to the recent past, and we need to analyze what we call the Soviet period. Cuba was a member of the Soviet bloc within the Comecon, Council for Middle Economic Cooperation, between 1972 and 1990. What meant for Cuba to be a member of the Comecon? Then, 80% of the trade was barter, no money. Then, Cuba got preferential prices. When in the world market, sugar price was 8-9 cents per pound, Comecon was paying Cuba 35-40 cents per pound. 4 times the market price. Then it was possible to get soft credits from the bank, the Comecon bank. 2%, 3% of interest. Very soft. And also, it was possible to make long-term agreements, let's say covering the 5-year plan. Think about not having any concern during the 5-year plan. But one day in 1990, the bloc collapsed. And then started what has been called, I repeat euphemistically, the special period. And the special period is just the severe crisis that came after the collapse of the Soviet bloc. In 1993, Cuba was at the bottom of the crisis, losing 38% of the GDP in 3 years. To illustrate that with a simple example, the number of buses in Havana fell from 1,500 to only 300 in 3 years. But in 1993, something happened. Suddenly, the city was flooded with dollars because Cuban immigrants started sending money to their families. But this created a big black market in the city. This is something very it's amazing because this money was flowing under the table, and millions of dollars were flowing to Cuba under the table. But as I said, the city was flooded with dollars, and this created a big black market. In 1993, $1, 150 pesos. I funded myself in 1993 earning $2 a month. But in order to stop this, the government then decided to legalize the circulation of the dollar in parallel with the Cuban peso. And that is the beginning of the dual currency that exists today in Cuba. So once the dollar was legal, sending money was legal. And here you have the answer. How is it possible that some people have money to build a house? A house, let's say a modest 2-bedroom house in Cuba would cost you $25,000, $30,000. Some people, as you saw, they have the money. And now lately, money is coming from other sources, but then in those years, the money was coming basically from outside. And in 1994, the self-employment was back. See? So self-employment was a way to reduce the high unemployment rate that existed in the 1990s. And also in 1994 was the opening of foreign investment. So that was oxygen for the economy. And look at the graph and you will understand then and now. Then, see the big impact of joining the Comecon, how the GDP grew, stayed there and collapsed after the Comecon. And today it moves up and down depending on many factors. So this is the difference between then and now. And to understand the role of that, the so-called special period, Let's take a look at this graph. I said, why don't we divide the time of the revolution in 3 periods? The guerrilla, the Comecon, the special period. So here started the revolution in 1959, and the guerrilla is in power, it's the provisional government, the revolutionary government, until 1975 when the new constitution and new institutions were created and Cuba became a new state. That period is a period of the homologation of the Cuban economy with the rest of the Comecon, and it goes from 1975 to 1990, the collapse of the Comecon. And then starts this special period. But if you look at the graph, you see that the special period means 45% of the revolution. Think about that. How much time spent keeping the country afloat, staying alive, with the supplies of and the subsidies of the Soviet Union, the Soviet bloc, and under the pressure of the American environment. Of course, a long crisis like that has its implications. So today we see how the side effects of these long crises are coming to the surface. And now, how important is Havana for Cuba? See, Havana is less than 1% of Cuba, but concentrates 1/5 of the population of the country. But pay attention. Today, every 5th person in Havana is over 60. Cuba is aging very fast. We have the largest number of professionals and scientists. See how Havana generates more than the half of the income from tourism. And the most important information here is this. Havana alone generates 54% of the GDP of Cuba. And this is telling you that now the distance between Havana and the rest of the country is enormous. And what about aging? The graph is evident. There is no replacement. Cuba is not only aging, it's not growing anymore. And if you look at this, it's very threatening because you see that today 20% of the population is over 60, but by 2030, it will be 30%. And then the question will not be that we need these homes for senior citizens, or we need to guarantee health care for them. No, the question is what kind of city Havana should be to host 1/3 of the population over 60. And when you look at these indicators, you see that fertility rate and gross reproduction rate are below the standards to keep the population growing. And the result is that the average Cuban family today is less than 3 members. In addition to this, we have another problem, that is migration. 65% of the people who leave Cuba, they leave from Havana. So Havana became a kind of a springboard to leave the country. Who is leaving? Young people between 25 and 35 with education. A brain drain. Even worse. Nearly 50% of the people who migrate out are young women. So there's a double loss. And who is coming? All kind of people. All kind of people because of the big difference between Havana and the rest of the country. It moves many people to come to Havana. They know that in Havana they have more possibilities to improve their lives. And the question about the people coming to the city is, if they cannot settle formally, they will do it informally, creating shantytowns. And this is very important. With this recycling, today only 30% of the people in Havana were born in Havana. So this means that there is a loss of identity. People come, many of the people who migrate to the city, they come to stay there for a while they prepare the conditions to migrate. And they don't care about the city. Other people come from small communities and they don't understand the big city and so on. So this is modifying the urban culture in the city. And the city can tell you more than I do. Who is in charge? Nobody. Nobody's in charge. And if nobody's in charge, you can do this. I call this picture my favorite color. See that the lack of authority is promoting individualism, not collectivism. And this is it. People are very selfish. They say, I don't care about the building. I care about my part. And this is an example of that legal limbo of who owns the building. If you go to visit Havana, you will see this. And you will wonder, why is that? Well, suppose that these two families were living on the average salary. But one day, the family to the right remembered that they had a relative in Miami who can send them money. Let's suppose that the relative in Miami is in capacity to send them $100 in money. That way, he will be sending 5 monthly salaries in one round. Immediately, the difference between the two neighbors will be 1 to 5. In other cases, it's 1 to 50. And this is just the urban expression of the new disparities that are appearing in the city because of this. Architecture. See what money and bad taste can do. When I show this, I always repeat, intelligence has its limits, but ignorance doesn't. Okay, what's going on in Cuba along these years of transformations? If you look at the chart, you see the evident decline of the sugar industry. So Cuba is not anymore the sugar power it was. Okay? But you see how tourism is growing steadily. So this means that the Cuban economy is not based on a commodity, it's based on a service that is provided. So this has implications because you can produce sugar elsewhere in the world, but tourism depends, because if your region, your province, don't have the conditions for tourism, is isolated. We are now very rich provinces and very poor provinces now. With this in mind, let's talk about some of the transformations that are taking place now. One of the big goals it was because it's not going to be achieved, is to reduce the state payroll by 500,000 less. How do you relocate 500,000 people out of the state payroll? Expanding the private sector. This is the goal. Up to 40% of the GDP is supposed to come from the private sector in the near future. The goals are just goals. Those who know about planning, we set a goal, but life set the other goal. Why agriculture is so important in Cuba? Cuba imports 80% of the food we consume. So Cuba depends largely on imported food. And with the growing number of tourists, this becomes a more acute problem. Well, recently there have been a plan to lease land for people who apply for this. So see, 150 acres, you can lease the land for 25 years. But the good is that you can settle there and your descendants can inherit the lease. So it's a way to resettle people back to the country. And now, urban and suburban agriculture are becoming more important. What about foreign investment in real estate? The way to incentivate that is to extend the land lease from 50 to 99 years. Because in Cuba, land is not for sale, it's for lease. And what about the domestic market? It was reopened in 2011 after decades of being frozen. So this is introducing new questions in the city. And now, what about the future? Let's take a look at the future and see what may come or not. Because the future never happened by itself, it was created. It's a principle. Okay. Let's see between the possible and the predictable. A sudden increase in the number of tourists. More Americans traveling to Cuba. And here you have the prediction made by the American Society of Travel Agencies, ASTA. They say that 1.8 million Americans will visit Cuba immediately after the lifting of the restrictions to travel. Think about it. This means that Cuba will go from 3 million now to nearly 5 in 2 years. Who can handle that? I don't know. But one thing is clear. The day this will happen, tourism in Cuba will be something completely different from now. What about reopening the real estate market? Social segregation will come back. And money talks. So now you see people with more money buying the best property, people being forced to sell, and so on. It's just the beginning. Let's see if we can control that or not. And what about the Chinatown? The same. If we do not manage to reduce the gap between Havana and the rest of the country, migration will continue, the problem will be there. So the question is how to reduce the gap in order to stop that migration. Okay, and here we have an example. I introduced here an example of what may happen if we open. There's a sudden opening to foreign investment in Cuba, and we do not care. Here is the most popular street in Havana, the Malecon. It's the avenue that goes along the shoreline. Remember, Cuba is a long and narrow city. And the present condition of the buildings is this. Vacant lots because the existing buildings were collapsed. And the remaining buildings are in very bad condition. So there's an opening, and the opening brings a lot of investment. And the result of the investment is that this is a good opportunity for foreign developers. And once they come, vacant lots are free, the existing building recover. See, now the existing building looks better, the other one too, but the skyline has changed. Well, there's still a presence of the original architecture. But after this, we have what we call the frenzy speculation. People start speculation, buying, selling, the big ones are coming and they say I want this, I want that, and so on. So the big leaders take the control, and this is what may happen. So see that only this remains from the existing skyline. So the regional skyline disappears. So we can witness the disappearance of a city just like this. So this is the warning. Beware, if not, the city will disappear. And what about Havana? Havana. We call Havana the last virgin city. It's a city that never experienced the urban renewal. No sprawl, no drugs, no guns, no racial and ethnic conflicts. It's a very quiet and a very peaceful city, but decaying. And decay moves people to react in different ways. Some people defend the idea that we should preserve the city the way it is. This is unique, it's different, let's preserve this. But at the same time, other people say, no. When they look around and see the dilapidation, they say the best idea would be to bulldoze given yourself the city to start building new and to have a brand new city. So we have two choices. And this moved me to introduce in the presentation an idea that I would like to share with you. Take a look. The human being is the only animal that stumbles twice on the same stone. Right? And what about if we stumble? Havana could end being this. And what is this? Shanghai. Shanghai is not anymore a Chinese city. It's a city in China. A friend of mine from here, from the States, who was there recently, told me that he was taken to see Chinatown here. And I believe him. Okay. But I heard people, I must say, it's sad to say that I heard people in Cuba, because some people in Cuba are very glared about the Chinese model. They say, but China was nothing, and look at them now. We must be China too. Yes, but we are not Chinese. And the question is to learn from others, not to imitate others. And when I hear somebody saying, imagine Havana looking like that, I ask, do you know the implications? You know the consequences of this? The consequences could be devastating. And we wouldn't like to see Havana in this. This is what we want. So whenever I see this, I always repeat, say, do what you can in order to preserve Havana as a Cuban city.